Red has a lot of effects that create token copies of things, but there's a lot of different ways that they go about them, so let's go over some of the nuances behind it. Now, something like Electro Duplicate might seem very similar to the last card I showed you, Kiki-Jiki, but the way that both of these effects work are very different from each other. Kiki-Jiki's effect creates something that we call a delay trigger that goes on the stack at the beginning of the next end step. Now, delay triggers are pretty much triggers that are created that trigger later in the turn. It will trigger only once when the trigger event happens, and then after that, it will never trigger again. With Kiki-Jiki, the trigger event is at the beginning of the end step. So if we skip our end step with something like Sundial of the Infinite that takes us directly to cleanup, then an event will never trigger. But also notice that Kiki-Jiki says at the beginning of the next end step, which means that this will trigger at the beginning of any next end step because each turn has an end step. So even if we skip our own end step, Kiki-Jiki will just trigger at the next end step, which is our opponent's. Now remember when I said that delay triggers only trigger once when the trigger event happens and it won't try to trigger again. So if we actually wait till our end step and then put this trigger on the stack, but before we resolve that trigger, we go to end the turn, we'll go straight to cleanup, removing that trigger off of the stack. And since this ability already got the trigger, it's not going to trigger again in any future turn. All the delayed trigger cares about is being put on the stack. It does not care about resolving. So with Electro Duplicate, it's probably the same thing, right? Well, Electro Duplicate works a little bit differently because this part is in quotations, which means that the creature itself is gaining the ability rather than it being a delay trigger. So since the copy of that creature will actually have this ability, it will trigger at the beginning of each end step. So even if we do the same trick with Sundial of the Infinite, this creature still has this ability where at the beginning of the end step, you have to sacrifice it. So the trigger will just go off again at the beginning of the next end step that you encounter. Now, let's say we made a copy of a creature with Kiki-Jiki and with Electro Duplicate, and our opponent plays Reigns of Power, gaining control of those creatures until the end of turn. When the end step comes around, they're going to still be controlling the creature, so what's going to happen to it? Well, with Kiki-Jiki, you'll have a delay trigger that gets put on the stack, and the controller of the delay trigger is the same controller as the effect that created it. So the instructions for that delay trigger is asking you to sacrifice the creature, but you don't control that creature. And since we can't sacrifice permanents we don't control, our opponent gets to keep the Kiki-Jiki copy, at least until the control effect of Reigns of Power ends, then it goes back to you, which you get to keep indefinitely. Now for Electro Duplicate, it's a little bit different because it's the creature that has an ability that puts a trigger on the stack, not a delayed trigger. And the controller of that creature also controls the triggered ability that it would put on the stack. So in this case, it's our opponent that controls the creature that controls that trigger that it puts on the stack, so they will have to sacrifice that token. Now, would the same thing be true if instead of sacrificing, they had to be exiled? Now again, with sacrifice, you can't sacrifice anything that you don't control. But with exile, there's no rule that says that you have to control the permanent to exile them. So in this case here, those tokens will still be exiled even though you don't control them.